Sang-hoo, heir of the Mafia family, didn't hesitate. He looked at the remaining applicants and made a decision everyone thought was ordinary. Hire her.
I
No
am?
debate. A quiet cook named Kofi.
Yes.
Nothing special on paper. But in that empire, every hire was survival critical. And the moment she stepped inside, things changed. Because the boss didn't just hire a cook. He hired someone far smarter than that before he ever understood it himself. And the man who had never been vulnerable to anyone was about to realize he had just let someone into his world he could no longer let go. The recruitment process looked less like a job interview and more like a military selection program. 22 applicants stood inside the service wing of one of Korea's most heavily guarded private estates. Most of them had years of culinary experience, and several had worked in luxury hotels. All of them wanted the position. The salary was extraordinary, including the benefits, and because people whispered that working for the Duyun family guaranteed financial security for life. The rumors rarely mentioned the danger, and the Duyun family owned legitimate businesses officially. Unofficially, everyone knew who they were and nobody talked about it. If staying alive is your priority. The applicants underwent interviews, background checks, practical cooking examinations, and psychological assessments. By the end of the second day, only 3 candidates remained. Among them was a quiet black woman named Kofi. She spoke little, answered questions directly, and never volunteered information, which immediately made her different from the others.
You all have impressive resumes.
Thank you.
But this is about more than just skills.
Sang-hoo, the Mafia heir of the Duyun Mafia family, was the one who conducted the entire interviews, and at the final valuation, he studied the leftover applicants carefully one after another. Then he pointed directly at Kofi. You're hire her. One of the culinary manager blinked. Boss, there are candidates with stronger credentials. But Sang-hoo gaze never moved. Hire her. That was the end of the discussion. The next morning, Kofi arrived at the estate carrying a single suitcase while a guard escorted her through enormous hallways. At the kitchen entrance, the estate manager stood there and his expression was unreadable. Your responsibilities are simple. You cook. You do not ask questions. You do not involve yourself in family matters. Understood. Then he added, do not investigate anything you see. Something flickered behind her eyes. Understood. Manager studied her carefully. As long as you remember that, you'll do well here. If he had known who she really was, he might have laughed at the irony, because before disappearing from public life, Kofi spent years doing exactly what she had just been ordered not to do, analyzing and finding truths powerful people wanted buried. Those skills were the reason she had vanished. Years earlier, she had exposed a criminal network operating across multiple countries. The investigation should have ended careers. Instead, it nearly ended her life. People disappeared after that case. Witnesses, sources, and informants. One by one, they all ghosted. Kofi stood the message. So she disappeared first to a new country with a new identity and new life. A life of no investigations, intelligence work, nor attention, just survival. That was her goal in her new life. Then she walked into the Duyun estate seeking for a job, and plans have a way of changing. The first dinner service arrived 2 days later. The menu seemed straightforward, a traditional Korean dishes that require simple presentation. Kofi spent the afternoon observing the people, staff, routines, and timing. By evening, she made several adjustments that were barely noticeable. Stuffs like different seasoning balance, slight temperature modifications, and specific serving sequences. But when dinner began, something unusual happened. Sang-hoo mother took one bite and then another. She said nothing, and yet she finished everything. Across the table, several family members exchanged glance. Even the usually critical aunt requested additional servings, but Sang-hoo ate quietly and didn't say a word. The dining room remained silent. Back in the kitchen, staff members began smiling and saying the new cook had survived her first test. What nobody realized was that Kofi wasn't paying attention to compliments. Instead, she was paying observing behaviors. Who started eating first, who waited, who watched others before touching their food, and those that voided eye contact. Plus whom didn't finish certain dishes. Every meal and seating arrangement revealed information. To her, it looked like intelligence gathering, and she couldn't stop herself. Not completely. Some instincts become permanent, even after you try to bury them. Over the following weeks, requests for her food became increasingly common. Sang-hoo mother requested specific soups, and the older relatives preferred her cooking over everyone else's. Staff members adjusted shifts just to eat leftovers from her kitchen. Even security guards lingered near service areas longer than necessary. The change wasn't only about food, it was about presence Kofi carried calm with her. When kitchen disputes emerged, she solved them quietly. Schedules collapsed. She reorganized them efficiently. Even when there's tensions, she somehow reduced them. She was useful in different ways and helped a lot around the house, and Sanghu mother and relatives began to love her. People in the mansion began seeking her out, because life seemed easier whenever she was around. Inside one of the most dangerous households in Korea, the newest employee had become an unexpected center of gravity, and that was when the first real problem appeared. We all know people who become important, eventually attract attention. Inside the estate, someone had started watching her. For the first month, Amara succeeded in doing exactly what she intended. She remained useful, nothing more. She cooked, worked, and stayed invisible. That was what she believed, but reality hit different. Inside the Duyun estate, invisibility was impossible when every person had a place. Movement was noticed, and slight change created ripples. And Amara had changed the atmosphere of the household. People laughed more around the service quarters. Arguments ended faster. Even the elderly family members seemed healthier. Nobody could explain why, but the effect simply existed. One afternoon, 2 kitchen assistants nearly came to blows over a scheduling mistake. The argument escalated quickly, voices rose and trays slammed onto counters. Several employees stopped working to watch. Kofi never raised her voice. She listened, asked 3 questions, moved 1 shift assignment, adjusted 2 responsibilities. The conflict disappeared within 5 minutes. The assistants returned to work looking almost embarrassed. The head chef stared at her. "How did you do that?" Kofi continued chopping vegetables. They weren't arguing about schedules. Chef frowned. "We're arguing about respect." She never explained further than that. Weeks later, another problem emerged. One of the elderly relatives, Sanghu uncle, suddenly refused to eat. Doctors were called. Nutrition specialists visited, but nothing worked out yet. The elderly man became increasingly irritable. The Mafia family grew concerned. Then Kofi quietly changed the meal routine. She moved dinner 20 minutes earlier and changed the serving order. 3 days later, Sanghu uncle was eating normally again. The family were happy about the recovery, but none realized she had solved a loneliness problem disguised as a medical problem. Except Sanghu, the Mafia boss, he was paying attention to what was happening around, and he kept wondering how a normal cook could do all of this. As for Kofi, her analyst talent followed her everywhere despite her trying to hide from that old life. The first leak happened on a Thursday evening. A black Toyota entered the estate. Nothing unusual about that, and visitors arrived regularly. Business partners, political contacts, and corporate executives. The vehicle stopped near the main entrance, and Kofi happened to be carrying supplies through a side corridor. She glanced toward the courtyard and she stopped walking. Something felt wrong. The driver exited first. Passenger followed, which looked normal, but the timing between movements wasn't normal. The spacing felt rehearsed. Kofi watched for another second, then continued walking. 5 minutes later, she found the estate operations manager. "You should increase security around today's guest." Manager looked confused. "Might be wrong." That answer immediately caught his attention. Most people either expressed certainty or fear, but Kofi expressed neither. "What did you see?" She hesitated too long. "I don't know." Manager frowned. "You don't know? I just think you should be careful." He almost laughed, but something about her expression stopped him. Later that evening, security teams discovered a concealed tracking device hidden underneath the visitor's vehicle. The guest had unknowingly been followed. The discovery prevented what could have become a serious security breach. When the report reached Sanghu, he asked one question: "Who noticed this?" The answer confused everyone. Then the operation man said the cook had earlier suggested increase in security today. "Cook," Sanghu said. Then he nodded. That was all. The next incident happened less than 2 weeks later. A regular supplier arrived 3 days earlier than scheduled. The paperwork appeared correct and delivery seemed legitimate. Everything looked normal, but to Kofi it wasn't. She examined the shipment records, then casually asked a staff member, "Has that company changed ownership recently?" The staff blinked. "Why? No reason," she said. The delivery patterns had changed for real, the routes and timing. Tiny inconsistencies, nothing alarming by itself. Yet together they formed a pattern. The operations manager investigated and noticed that indeed the supplier had changed ownership 3 months earlier, and that the new owners had connections to a rival gang. Again, Nobody understood how the cook noticed it, and people started asking questions. The questions eventually reached someone very dangerous. Sanghu. And Sanghu was a person most feared than death. He rarely concerned himself with domestic staff. Employees came and went. Most never entered his thoughts, but Kofi became an exception. He recalled the last report about the tracking device, which he didn't say anything. Report kept coming. Each story sounded stranger than the last. The cook noticed this, predicted that, identified a problem, prevented another problem. Eventually, Sanghu closed the report and looked at his security chief. How old is she? The question surprised him. 32. Former military. No. Enforcement. No. Corporate intelligence. No. Sanghu leaned back and run thoughts in his mind. Several days later, he saw her while he was crossing an internal corridor when he noticed activity in the kitchen. Employees moved efficiently. Orders flowed smoothly. At the center stood Kofi. She wasn't commanding anyone, yet everyone unconsciously adjusted around her. Sanghu watched for several moments. Then he noticed something stranger. She was observing everything. More like the same way a security specialist might observe a crowded room. Or an intelligence analyst. His eyes narrowed. A cook should not look at the world that way. Before he could continue the thought, Kofi glanced up. Their eyes met briefly. Most people reacted with fear immediately when they realized he was around, but Kofi simply looked and acknowledged him, then returned to work. That night, Sanghu found himself thinking about it, not because he liked her. He was thinking about the whole situation because she didn't fit. Nothing about her fit. The reports, observations, instincts, confidence, and the absence of fear. Each piece created a question, and unanswered questions had always irritated him. By the following week, he began noticing her more often. He reviewed reports she influenced, observed interactions, watched outcomes. The pattern became impossible to ignore. She saw things before others did, consistently. One evening, while discussing an internal issue with senior advisors, Sanghu paused unexpectedly. A prediction surfaced in his memory, something Kofi had casually mentioned days earlier. At the time, everyone ignored it. Now it had happened exactly as she suggested. The room continued talking. Sanghu wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about the cook. There was only one logical conclusion. Kofi was hiding something. The question was what? And for the first time in months, Sanghu became interested in uncovering a mystery. A mystery that worked in his kitchen and seemed to understand his world far better than she should. The first direct interaction between them happened when someone made a mistake. Inside the Duyun family's world, the difference was often impossible to tell. It began with a dinner. A routine gathering, nothing unusual on the surface. Several senior members of the organization were present. A few trusted advisors, family representatives. People whose decisions affected millions of dollars and countless lives. The atmosphere was tense. An internal dispute had been growing for weeks. Different factions wanted different outcomes. Nobody was openly challenging Sanghu, but pressure was building. Kofi sensed it before she understood it. Conversations stopped whenever certain names appeared, meetings ran longer, security deployments shifted, and then staff members became unusually nervous. The estate felt like dry grass waiting for a spark. Then the spark arrived. Dinner service had already begun when Kofi noticed something strange. One of the serving attendants was unfamiliar, though the identification badge symbol was correct. Everything appeared normal, but yet something about the woman felt wrong. Kofi couldn't immediately explain why, so she watched. The attendant avoided eye contact with senior staff and other attendants, which was not normal. Also, her movements were careful, too careful. Kofi continued plating dishes. Watching and thinking, then she saw it. A tiny hesitation, barely noticeable. The attendant paused beside one particular tray for less than a second. Most people would never have seen it. Kofi did. Her pulse slowed. Years earlier, during intelligence operations, Kofi had learned something important. People trying to hide actions often focus too much on controlling themselves. The effort becomes visible. The attendant was controlling herself, which meant she had something to hide. Kofi immediately changed course without creating panic or attracting attention. She simply walked toward the serving line and picked up the tray, then replaced it with another. The attendant froze, only for a fraction of a second. The attendant saw that Kofi saw it. Neither woman said a word. The meal proceeded. Guests continued eating. Everything appeared normal for exactly 23 minutes. Then the attendant disappeared. Security discovered her attempting to leave the estate through a service exit. She was detained immediately. The investigation that followed uncovered traces of a sophisticated poisoning attempt. Not enough poison to kill instantly, rather enough to create confusion. Illness. When the report reached Sang-hoo, he read it twice, then looked up. Who stopped it? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the security chief spoke. Cook. Silence. Sang-hoo stared at him. Cook. How? The chief hesitated. Nobody knows. That answer annoyed him even more because there was always a reason, always. The next morning, Kofi was summoned. For the first time, she entered a private study overlooking the estate gardens. The room was quiet and large. Power radiated from it. Sang-hoo stood near the window, his hand behind his back. Close the door. Kofi did. The silence stretched. Finally, he faced her. Change the tray. Why? I had a concern. Concern? Kofi met his gaze. A possibility. His eyes narrowed. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Response should have frustrated him. Instead, it intrigued him. She wasn't lying. She genuinely didn't seem interested in defending herself or impressing him. Talk less of recognition. Most people would have wanted something, possibly a promotion, approval, or influence. Kofi wanted none of those things, and that made her difficult to read. You prevented a serious incident. She said nothing. You understand that? Yes. You may have saved lives. Still nothing. Sang-hoo studied her carefully. Any other employee would have been proud, excited, and nervous. Eventually, he asked the question that had been bothering him for weeks. Who are you? The room became very still. Kofi's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. And Sang-hoo, that had been wondering the mystery, felt he had touched a locked door. Your cook. Answer came immediately. A faint smile appeared on Sang-hoo's face. He knew she was hiding something. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Neither obtained the answers they wanted. Yet when Kofi left the room, something had changed. A line had quietly been crossed. Because after that meeting, Sang-hoo started seeking her opinion. At first indirectly. A question passed through staff, an observation requested, and concern mentioned casually. Yet again and again, her assessments proved accurate. One evening, an advisor recommended expanding into a new business partnership. Most executives supported the proposal due to the fact it appeared profitable and safe. Sang-hoo remembered something Kofi had said while reviewing food deliveries earlier that week. A casual observation, nothing more. People become careless when they rush growth. A strange comment. At the time it seemed unrelated, and now it lingered in his thoughts. He ordered additional investigations. The partnership collapsed under scrutiny, hidden liabilities and false reporting. Potential disaster avoided, another prediction and instinct. This became the reason he couldn't stop thinking about her. The dependency began quietly. Days passed, then weeks. Without realizing it, Sang-hoo started checking whether she was present. That became one of his habit, a glimpse of activity in the kitchen. A familiar voice speaking with staff, evidence that everything was functioning normally. When she wasn't there, he noticed. And that bothered him. One afternoon, he arrived home after a brutal negotiation. Violence had nearly erupted. Several trusted alliances were becoming unstable, and the entire day had been exhausting. As he crossed the dining hall, he asked a passing employee, "Where's Kofi?" The question left his mouth before he could stop it. The employee blinked. "She's off today." Sang-hoo frowned. Why? He couldn't explain it. She was an employee, nothing more. Yet the estate felt different without her, less balanced and predictable. The realization made him felt unstable even more. He began trusting her instincts over experienced advisors, and every time he caught himself doing it. Yet somehow her judgment kept proving valuable. Meanwhile, Kofi noticed the change due to the increased questions, the indirect requests, growing reliance and attention. It was becoming dangerous, not physically. Personally, the closer people looked at her, the greater the chance they would discover who she had been, and who she had been was a problem that could destroy the life she had built. So she responded the only way she knew how, by creating distance. When staff discussed personal matters, she listened but shared little. When family members asked about her past, she redirected the conversation. When Sang-hoo attempted casual questions, she answered only what was necessary, nothing more. Beneath her calm exterior, fear had begun returning, not fear of the Do-yun Mafia family. It was fear of recognition, exposure that somewhere, somehow. The ghosts she escaped years ago were finally catching up, and she was right, because far beyond the walls of the estate, someone had already started searching. Who had seen her patterns before? Someone who recognized the signature of a mind trained to observe, and that person was getting closer. Hundreds of kilometers away from Do-yun estate, a man paused a surveillance recording and replayed it for the fourth time, then a fifth. The footage wasn't remarkable. It was a delivery checkpoint. Routine security screening. employees moving through service gates. Nothing unusual except for one woman crossing the frame carrying a crate of vegetables. Most people would have ignored her. The man didn't. The kind intelligence professionals recognized immediately. He leaned back slowly. No. A younger analyst looked over. What is it? The man replayed the footage again. His expression darkened. Seen that before? Younger analyst frowned. Answer came almost as a whisper. Operations D5. They stare at each other without a word because there was only one person everyone remembered from Operations D5, one analyst, investigator, one disappearance, and one ghost. Kofi, the woman who vanished years ago. Officially, nobody knew where she went. Unofficially, many believed she was dead. The man stared at the screen. If he was correct. Then one of the most sought-after former intelligence analysts in the region had just appeared inside one of Korea's most powerful criminal organizations, and if that was true, everything was about to become complicated, very complicated. The investigation began quietly. No announcements or public search, just tiny questions spread through criminal networks, information brokers and private intelligence circles, old contacts, people who sold secrets for money. The name itself wasn't mentioned at first, only descriptions, patterns, behavior, and capabilities. The net widened slowly and eventually. One thread reached the outskirts of the Duyun organization. The first warning arrived disguised as ordinary business intelligence. A rival faction had begun gathering information about the estate, but the focus seemed strange. They weren't investigating finances, operations, or territory, rather they were after household, kitchen, and support staff. The report landed on Sang-hoo's desk. His instincts reacted immediately. Something felt wrong. He read the report again, then again. One name appeared indirect repeatedly. Questions about schedules, access, kitchen operations, and that all circled the same person. The realization sent a cold feeling through him, not fear. Something sharper, more like concern, so he ordered additional surveillance, additional counterintelligence measures, quietly, without informing anyone why. The following week confirmed his suspicions. Someone was searching for her. The question was who, and more importantly, why. Meanwhile, Kofi already knew, not the details, but the pattern, pressure, and the feeling. Former analysts developed instincts difficult to explain. Sometimes information arrived before evidence. Sometimes danger appeared first as intuition. The world around her had changed. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Unknown faces appeared near supply routes. Questions became more frequent, more specific. Someone was digging. She felt it. The certainty settled into her chest like stone. One evening, she stood alone in the service garden behind the estate. She considered leaving, simply disappearing again, before anyone discovered the truth and before anyone became involved. And history repeated itself. It would be safer, cleaner. She stared into the darkness, then heard footsteps behind her.
You're thinking about leaving?
Sang-hoo's voice. Kofi closed her eyes briefly. Of course he noticed. He does notice more now. The silence answered him. He stepped closer. Why? She smiled faintly. People always ask that question. And no one likes the answer. Wind shifted through the trees. Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Sang-hoo. No, someone is looking for you. A question. Kofi's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. For weeks he had suspected. Now he knew she was hiding something real and dangerous, but not who she was. What did you do? Kofi laughed softly. The sound carried no humor. That's usually the wrong question. Then what's the right question? She looked toward the distant city lights. What did I uncover? The words lingered between them. Sang-hoo felt something click into place, that she wasn't running because she committed a crime. She was running because she found one, large enough to destroy lives, enough to erase her own. For the first time, genuine concern appeared in his voice. How dangerous? Kofi finally looked at him, really looked at him. The answer was visible before she spoke. Dangerous enough, that was all she said. Yet somehow it was enough, because Sang-hoo saw something he had never seen before in her. Fear. And suddenly he understood something else. She had spent years carrying it alone. The next month became a race neither of them fully understood. Outside forces moved closer. Questions became investigations. Investigations became conclusions, and conclusions became targets. The rival faction finally identified a partial connection, a former analyst, missing intelligence operative, a woman connected to a criminal exposure case years ago. The danger escalated immediately because information had value and people were willing to kill for valuable information. One evening, Sang-hoo received confirmation. The searchers were no longer investigating. They were preparing for action. The report sat open on his desk. Several options existed. He could ignore it, allow events to unfold naturally and protect his empire first. That would be a safe decision, but instead he decided to protect Kofi. He was ready to risk and take on whatever action those looking for her was ready to explore. Risk destabilizing his own operations, the very idea should have been ridiculous. Yet he couldn't dismiss it. Because over the past months, something had changed. She had become part of the structure holding the estate together, part of his life, thinking, and the future he unconsciously expected. And losing her suddenly felt unacceptable. 3 days later, Kofi received official notice. Her employment contract would end within 2 weeks. Renewal paperwork remained unsigned. The document sat in her hands as she stared at it quietly. A strange calm settled over her. Perhaps this was how it ended. Leave before the find you, that was I thought. Before anyone became a casualty because of her. That night she packed her suitcase, ready to disappear once again. Then a knock came at the door. She opened it. A security officer stood outside. "Boss requests your presence." Immediately. The officer's expression suggested urgency. Something serious had happened. Kofi followed him through the silent hallways, toward a decision that would change everything. The study was darker than usual. Only a single lamp illuminated the room. Kofi entered. She immediately sensed something had changed. Sang-hoo stood behind his desk holding a thin file. The security officer quietly closed the door behind her. They were alone. Then Sang-hoo placed the file on the desk. "You should look at this." Kofi already knew. Before opening it, the feeling settled deep in her stomach. She opened the file. The first page contained a surveillance image. The second contained an old intelligence photograph. The third contained fragments of reports, connections, timelines, analysis. Her former identity. Kofi slowly closed the file. Her hands remained steady. Years of training, survival, and learning how not to react, yet inside. She understood exactly what this meant. The search was over. Someone had found the trail, and once one person found it, others would follow. Finally she spoke. "Leave tonight." Sang-hoo looked at her. She continued. "Longer I stay, the worse this becomes." No response. "I should have left earlier." Still silence. "Estate becomes a target if I'm here." Words felt strangely difficult to say. This place had become more than a hiding place. The people here mattered. The staff, family members, even him. And that made leaving hurt more than expected. Close the file completely. Disappear. Then she turned toward the door and heard his voice. "No." Kofi stopped. The single word echoed through the room. She turned slowly. Sang-hoo's expression remained calm, but something dangerous existed beneath the calm. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "I understand perfectly." The first time in months, emotion entered her voice. "If they find me, they won't stop." His gaze never moved. "I know. They won't care who gets hurt. Either would they stop until I'm out. Let them bring it on. No one war against me and survive if they are so desperate for death. I will make their wish come true." Answer came steady and certain, as though he had already considered every consequence, risk, and possible outcome and chosen anyway. Sang-hoo made his choice, the choice that would have horrified half his advisors. Every strategist would reject. "I'm not letting you leave." Kofi stared at him. "You don't mean that." "Do. This could damage everything you've built." "Let's see." The answer came immediately. She shook her head slowly in disbelief. "You should choose your empire." The words came almost as a plea, because she understood what he was sacrificing. Sang-hoo's expression softened slightly. Then he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "The only person here who never wanted anything from me. You only ever tried to keep people safe." Kofi felt her throat tighten unexpectedly, a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling, because nobody had ever truly seen her in the past years, and that made the moment infinitely harder. The silence stretched. Neither looked away. The decision had already been made. By sunrise, the entire estate had transformed. Security teams repositioned, communications rerouted, counterintelligence operations activated, safe locations prepared, false trails deployed. The response moved with military precision. They were protecting one person and everyone knew it. Rumors spread immediately, questions followed. Several senior advisors confronted Sang-hoo directly and his answer never changed. The decision stands. No explanation. No debate. Outside forces soon discovered something unexpected. Every path leading toward Kofi suddenly disappeared. Records vanished. Witnesses became unreachable, and information sources went off. Entire investigative channels collapsed overnight. Someone powerful was protecting her, willing to spend enormous resources doing it. The search continued. For a while, then gradually weakened, and then failed. The outside forces couldn't tell if she still worked inside the Duyun estate because they had no intel of her anymore. Because even determined hunters eventually stop chasing prey that becomes impossible to find. Kofi was no longer alone. Months later, peace returned. The estate felt alive again. One afternoon, Sanghu mother sat in the garden sipping tea. Kofi served lunch nearby. The old woman watched her quietly, then smiled. "You stayed." Kofi returned the smile. "Apparently." Across the courtyard, Sanghu stood speaking with several executives. For a brief moment their eyes met, and they smiled at each other. The next day, Sanghu visited the kitchen. The staff froze the moment he stepped in, but he didn't acknowledge them. His attention had already locked onto Kofi at the center of her space, moving like the room answered to her rhythm. Chopping, tasting, adjusting heat like she could hear the food before it spoke. Sanghu watched longer than necessary. Then he stayed for hours. Day after day, the pattern repeated. He began appearing in the kitchen more often than his office. At first, it looked like oversight, control, inspection, authority. But it wasn't that. It was curiosity that had turned personal. He started asking her questions he never asked anyone before. Why that ratio of spice? Why that order of plating? Why do you pause before you serve that dish? Kofi never over-explained.
About 3 minutes for a perfect crust.
And the sauce, is that house-made?
Yes, chef's secret recipe.
That's impressive.
And somehow, that made him listen even harder. Because for a long run in years, Sanghu wasn't being obeyed, he was being understood. Weeks passed beneath that quiet evolution. Sanghu moved his real pieces. The search for Kofi's past, the shadow hunting her, was no longer just intelligence work. It became personal correction. His network expanded silently across borders. Financial trails were cut. Informants traced. Old intelligence fragments stitched together until finally the name surfaced. The man behind it all, the one who had been closing in on her. Sanghu didn't announce anything. He simply left one night and returned 2 days later with nothing but calm in his eyes. The hunter never made another move in the future because he has ceased to exist. No headlines followed nor public trace. Only silence. When he returned to the estate, he said nothing about it to Kofi. The estate stabilized into something strange, less like a criminal empire, more like a functioning world orbiting an unspoken center. Kofi remained in the kitchen. Sanghu remained in his shadows. But the distance between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like intention. Then, months later, the truth of what had been done never surfaced, but peace did. And in that peace, something unspoken finally became inevitable. One night, Kofi stayed late in the kitchen. She turned, only to find him already there, leaning against the doorway like he had been there longer than time allowed. "You're still working," he said quietly. "You're still watching," she replied. A pause. Then, softer than anything he had ever used with anyone. "I don't know when this started, but I can't go back to before it." Kofi looked at him for a long moment, not as a cook nor an employee, as something dangerously close to home, and she didn't step away. Then Sanghu said, standing close to her while looking straight into her eyes, "I want us to build together and forever." She looked at him and smiled. "I will be there with you," she said. Time moved differently after that. The estate didn't just run. It settled, and somewhere between power and peace, they built something together. Years later, the mansion no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a beginning that had learned how to survive itself, and one morning, laughter echoed where silence used to rule. 2 children, twins, running through the halls towards their grandmother and relatives, the same hallway that once carried war in every shadow. Sanghu stood by the window, watching them, expression unreadable to everyone except one person. Kofi stepped beside him. Then he spoke. "No one will ever take this from us." She glanced at him and said, "I know, my love." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they stayed together that way for minutes watching. "I still remain your writer and director, Charles. See you all in the next one."